the difference. I mean, do you not think that Asata Shakur could be termed as someone who hated white people?
I mean, I don't know her, right? I just know her writings.
Well, yeah, I only know her writings as well.
Right. So I can't say if she hates white people or not. I can say that the statement that you put in the video, that everyone was chanting, is so innocuous that it shouldn't, that you portrayed it as something that was so nefarious. But that statement was about as bland as, it's kind of milquetoast.
Really? Okay. So I'm just going to get the statement up exactly.
Yeah, I'll pull it up for you. I think I have it around here somewhere. Where did I put it? It's our duty to fight. It's our duty to win. We must love each other and protect each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. I mean, that could almost be a biblical scripture. Like, it's so innocuous.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It sounds like a cult chant to me. And saying, well, that could be a biblical scripture. Yeah, it could.
The pledge of cult chant, like a cult chant. I mean, if you get the right crowd saying it, the Star Spangled Banner is, anything could be a cult chant.
Yeah, absolutely. Nationalism is a form of cult behavior. Yeah. It absolutely is. And that's the thing. I mean, don't you think it's a bit ironic for people in a free state to say that it's their duty to fight for their freedom?
Why would that be ironic when freedom is not really defined equally across the board?
Well, I don't know if that's necessarily true. It's whether the condition of the people under that definition of freedom actually meets the terms. And I agree that, like in the 70s, black people didn't. But do you think that it really makes sense in 2016 or 2017 now for college students, for middle-class college students to be chanting that in universities?
Yeah, so when they stand a 2.5% chance more likelihood of being killed by the police, yeah. When African Americans use marijuana, thankfully we're getting out of this era in America. But when we use marijuana at about the same rate as any other as white people, but we're 2 times as likely to actually get arrested and charged for it, then yeah, there's still problems here.
Yeah, and again, this is another one of those generalizations, isn't it? Because I really don't think that a black person in like Hollywood has the same chance as a black person in Chicago, for example.
If you throw the class dynamic in it, sure, it doesn't break apart completely, but it is.
No, but that's my point, isn't it? Like you said, if you leave out the class dynamic, then you have an incomplete analysis, and it's easy to default back to the racial analysis, but it's just not very useful.
We're still talking about the vast majority of African Americans. I mean, 50% of African Americans make less than $35,000 a year. So it's far more likely that you are poor as an African American than you are rich as an African American. So these statistics, even with the class analysis, it's even more salient because more than likely, if you're black, you're born into poverty.
That's true, but whose fault is that?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Whose fault do you think it is?
I think it's the fault of the black people who don't get married.
The black people who don't get married. Okay, yeah. Explain more. Give me a little
bit. I should have got it in advance so I could give you the source, but I'll find it afterwards for you. But basically, I read Thomas Sowell's Wealth, Power, and Politics, or Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. I can't remember the title exactly. But basically, he points out that black families in America who are married, black couples in America are married and have children, they have an average of $66,000 as a household income, which I don't think is under the poverty line at all. I think that's actually quite respectable. Whereas if you look at the income, the household incomes of single black parents, they're like $22,000, $24,000 a year. So it's obvious that marriage is a beneficial status for a working class family.
So then we should totally just start arranging marriages to make sure.
Hang on. But this is the thing, because like 70% of black people in America aren't married, and so it's like, okay, so whose fault is that? Is it the white person's fault, or is it? I mean, whose fault is it that these people aren't getting married?
No, I mean, are you married? Or
I am married. Yeah.
I mean, I got lucky. I got married. So it happens. I mean, people get married. But, I'm sure if we take an analysis of like Tinder or something like that, we'll find that there are a lot of single people out in the world. I mean, to ask why they don't get married is kind of fatuous, don't you think?
Well, no, I actually think this is where we need to start going with this, because, like you say, we can't just force people to get married. That's ridiculous. It's obviously ridiculous. But it does seem to be an aspect. I mean, there is a reason that there is a stereotype that black people don't have fathers, because fatherlessness is such an endemic problem in black communities.
So that's not exactly true, right? So there's a recent research by that was forwarded by a book called All In by Josh Levs that shows that Black people, even though they're not married to their baby mama, for lack of a better phrase at the top of my tongue, they are just as active, or actually more active in the lives of their children than any other demographic, white, Hispanic, or whatever. So because they are single, yes, they are single, but does that mean that they're fatherless? No, absolutely not.
Well, I think that it probably means that a large percentage of them are, and I think that you can't suggest that. I mean, this is going to be equal as people who are married with fathers in the household, and I think that's the main thing. The fathers living with their children, where I mean, 72%. I've just got a thing up. I'll send you. 72% of Black mothers are unwed. Now, obviously, a percentage of those are going to have a significant other living in the house, but is it going to be the child's biological father? Possibly not.
I mean, but
do you not think that that's a bit of an issue?
Biological father. I mean, the data still shows that there is a father figure, whether they live in the home or not, right? So the question is there a dynamic difference between them living in the home and not living in the home? I'm sure there's research that confirms that, but they're not fatherless. And this idea of Black fatherlessness is built on the fact that they are not married, that women are single, and 72%. Let's take your data, for example. But that's just a piece of data. It doesn't really argue an argument, right? The data that corresponds with that says that even though they're not in the house, they're still participatory in their children's lives. So, I mean, we have to really.
But I don't think that's a good substitute for having a father in the house.
I'm sure there's plenty of people who would rather. I mean, so then what do we do? Do we force people to get married? I mean,
this is the thing, right? This is the point that we come to, because I think that we can agree that it's definitely beneficial for, and it's not just for Black men, obviously. This is just, and I think honestly, this is just a young male problem, as in young men need their fathers around. I think this is definitely, and I know this personally because my dad was in the Royal Air Force, and he spent 6 months out in Iraq during the invasion of Iraq, and another 6 months out in the Falkland Islands, which was it's a long way from Britain. And I was I think 12 and 14 when this happened, and looking back now, I could see myself going off the rails just with only having my mother around.
Absolutely. Now, are you talking about Iraq 1 or Iraq 2? I'm trying to gauge how old you are.
I'm 37 actually.
37. Oh no, we're the same age group. Okay, so you mean Iraq 1?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And
I will say this to confirm what you're saying. Obviously, like the presence of a father in a home changes, or a father figure, or
it doesn't have to necessarily be their father, but a father figure who cares about the child.
But I mean, we can't rip away the class analysis here out of convenience, right? So the class analysis in the United States is just across the board. If you are born in poverty, you have like a 3% chance likelihood to get out of poverty to the upper middle class. I mean, there is a tremendous problem of upward mobility in the United States that becomes a feedback loop. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, I mean, if we're going to analyze the problems of poverty, we can't just take the class element out.
And I'm not trying to, and I agree. I totally agree with you on the issue of poverty. But I think it's really important to get to this point where we can say, look, I do think the degradation of the Black family is doing a disservice to Black kids. I mean, if you look at I did a video a while ago, literally, why do Black people commit more crime? Which really upset the white nationalists, because I didn't just say it was because they were Black. I actually said there might actually be real problems that are causing this. Part of that video, one of the statistics I was looking at was, if you look at a timeline of criminality in the Black community compared to single parenthood, then you can see, like, at the beginning of the 80s, single parenthood, the middle of the 70s, single parenthood starts to really rise. It starts going up. And then about 14 years later, youth crime also goes up. And so it's obvious that these kids who have been raised in single parent households have become delinquents.
Yeah. So, I mean, you gave the exact timeline that I was actually getting ready to address, right? So there have been policies, and we're finding out even more so now that there are policies that have directly targeted the Black community for the purposes of destroying the Black community. Richard Nixon, we just got his notes that were released 22 years after an interview. One of his aides let us know that the war on drugs out of Richard Nixon's mouth was targeting the Black community. And so not only did they flood the community with drugs, but then they arrested them for becoming addicted to drugs. They arrested them for selling the drugs. And so if there's ever a cause, right, if we're looking for a cause, a trigger point, it's consistent with the timeline that you just gave, that there has been a war waged on the Black community from the White House. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot of factors involved in crime. I mean, we could just be
okay. Hang on, let's take that point, because I think that's a really interesting point. Okay, so what should the Black community do in response to that?
Well, we had to figure out what the hell was going on first, right? There's a lot of swift boating that took place between then and now, and we're just now getting a holistic picture. So what can we do to fix the problems of 40 years ago? There's nothing we can do. All we could do is realize what happened and then try to address it systemically versus haphazardly based on anecdotal information.
Well, actually, I actually think that an individual approach could really solve the problem. Because, I mean, systemically, it's really just a collection of individual actions. And I think that, I actually think that the Black community could really benefit from Stoicism, which is an ancient Greek philosophy that basically the individual is responsible to everything that happens to them. And obviously that's not necessarily true in every case, but there's an underlying philosophy behind it that's effectively you do what is within your power. And it's absolutely within the power of the Black community to form cohesive, solid family units, raise children who aren't delinquents, and integrate into the system, get jobs, get themselves out of poverty, and so then get themselves onto.
We're going underneath this assumption that there is an epidemic in the Black community that is not reflective of the broader trend in the United States. I mean, just even religious people in the United States are overwhelmingly divorced. Like that's just the single.
That is true, but the Black community is worse. It is certainly worse than the Black communities. And
right, but you're asking of the Black community for us to ascend above something that is systematic. I mean, it's across the United States, right? But you're saying that for the issues of the Black community, you know, for us to rise above, we have to rise above the collectiveness of the United States. And I mean, you could argue that, but that's not something that I feel is even beneficial to the conversation, mainly because it completely puts the onus on the responsibility on the individual without ever looking at the systemic forces around it. I mean, you know,
I guess the reason I say that,
right?
Well, the reason I say that is because the systemic forces are actually not as powerful as you think. That's my point.
Well, you know, when you only stand a 3% chance of getting out of poverty, right? Even if, you know, that's married people and single people, that's really a systemic force that no one has when you're born into poor schools, right? You're born into.
I don't agree that it is married people. On average, married Black couples have an income of 68,000 or 66,000. So I wouldn't consider that an impoverished household income. So
right,
I think
the fact still remains, right? It's a statistical fact that you really stand a very little chance of getting out of this poverty. I agree. We're looking at the married Black couples, right, and saying, oh, they're doing well, but at the same time, you're arguing that the Black people aren't doing well. So if we're going to look at the people who aren't doing well, you have to look at where they are starting from, and the majority of them are starting in abject poverty. I mean, less than 20,000.
Yeah, and I think that they're in abject poverty because they come from single parent households.
And in your conversation about the chicken or the egg, you said that the chicken, you know, the single parents came first in this entire equation, not the fact that the Black community was completely flooded by drugs for an entire generation.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to downplay.
And the fathers were systematically taken out of the homes. You know, because
how were the fathers taken out of the homes? How were they taken out of the homes?
They've been imprisoned, like overwhelmingly.
Yeah, but why were they imprisoned?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to ask the question: why was there a war on drugs that targeted the Black community?
I'm not trying to absolve the U.S. government, but what I'm saying is, these people only have the power that you give them. Really, I mean, if the Black community were to act like the Hindu community in Britain, then they would simply. You wouldn't really have the opportunity because
Yeah,
these people would live well through right action.
yeah. Well, so if the
Pressure on
Hindu
government would
community
do nothing.
is ever strategically targeted, let's go back further past because I want to show you this. It's actually a trend, right?
Mhm.
You go back further to the 1920s, early 20th century. You see thriving African American communities where there's a lot of wealth that's being generated and amassed, and families are, banks are open, schools are built, all Black. And what happens to those communities? Well, Rosewood, Florida, completely destroyed by white nationalists. Black Wall Street, Tulsa, massacred. I mean, massacred literally, where they took planes and shot people and dropped bombs from the air. I mean, anytime there has been a movement towards Black independence and Black solidarity, all these things that people say, oh, pull yourself up by your bootstrap, we see that it's targeted not just by vigilantes, but by the government. So there has been systematic problems.
Okay, but how long ago was that?
I mean, there's people who are still alive today who were there. So I'm not sure.
So
how
that 50, 60 years, something like that?
No, I mean, we're getting close. Well, not alive during Black Wall Street, but yeah.
Right, because I think, honestly, I do think that the situation has probably changed by now. And I think that calling back something that happened a long time ago is, I mean, it's important to know, but I think it's important to not let that hang over your head.
Well, it's not a matter of hanging over your head. It's just a matter of what resources did a generation start with, right? And we look at a generation, this is the ironic thing. A lot of white people think Black people just came into existence in 64, 65 with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and think nothing about the systemic forces that existed before that, right? Yeah. So we like to have a cutoff date and say, oh, that's no longer relevant. Well, when your trajectory in life is based on how much wealth your parents have, it's completely relevant to and this from a class analysis. Why would we deprive the Black community of a class analysis just simply because the roots of that class, of where they started in the class structure, was targeted, they're plundered. Our communities were ravaged economically.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just we don't like you because you're Black. They stole our capital for generations. And now you have a generation that's born with zero capital, born in abject poverty, and we wonder why their children are in poverty. I mean, that's highly
No, that's the thing. We actually don't. We know exactly why their children are in poverty.